Thank you for being back, and I'm very happy to introduce Ben Faber, who's a professor of economics at Berkeley, and he has produced some of the most creative work on trade and development, and because of that, I think it was great that he accepted the role of guest editor for the special issue of trade and uneven development. So without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much. Thanks to the organizers for asking me to speak today, and more importantly to the program selection committee for doing an excellent job and picking a set of high quality and very interesting papers. I look forward to seeing more of each of those papers and be in contact with all of the authors as part of the special issue that we're putting together, and that's going to be fun over the next coming weeks and months. Okay, so I believe the plan of the talk for today was that I relate some of the work that I've done together with many others to the broader topic of trade and development, and I thought that was a great opportunity to take a 2024 stock of what trade and development has looked like over the most recent decades. Before I get there, I feel obliged to echo a point that everybody in this room knows, and I'm sure about that. And that is that, the parenthesis on the uneven, right? So the perspective that we take on the question of trade and inequality, or the scale at which we ask that question, matters. Most of the research that is done, understandably, looks at the relationship between globalization and inequality within country or within markets, because we need multiple data points to run regressions. And that is interesting and that is relevant. The media then also, catches up on those themes. But if you take a broader perspective, right, a perspective that institutions like the World Bank are uniquely well equipped to take and lobby for, and you consider the question of globalization and inequality from the perspective of the world income distribution, then there's a good case to be made that globalization has meaningfully contributed to a decrease in global inequality. Now that is harder to nail causally, because we only have one global income distribution, so it's harder to run regressions on that. But I think it's really hard to imagine some of the most successful anti-poverty alleviation programs in human history that have happened in East Asia over recent decades, raising hundreds of millions of people out of poverty without open borders, without exporting and importing and foreign direct investment and flows of passengers transferring knowledge and technology and so forth. So in the current political climate, I think that's important to keep in mind, as protectionism, that maybe in part is motivated by reducing inequality, could also close economic opportunities to some of the more vulnerable parts of the world income distribution. So I think that's important to always have in mind in these discussions, especially in a global forum like the World Bank. So now to what's on the menu on the talk today. So much of recent reporting suggests that globalization is in retreat. I think we all have felt that. We all have thought about that. Penny Goldberg did a great keynote, dating some of the events, starting with political events in England and in the United States around 2016, the following, U.S.-China trade wars, the pandemic and the strategic policy concerns and supply chain reliability that came with that, the geopolitics of the current political moment, the invasion of Ukraine, have all contributed to the political climate on globalization where we're in, and the sense that globalization is in retreat or in crisis. So when I looked at the standard trade statistics and FDI statistics that we use as metrics of globalization for the first part of the talk, which is this second bullet here, I wasn't quite sure what to expect of how our standard cross-border metrics have looked over the most recent metrics. And what I'll show you is that in these standard metrics, globalization seems to have meaningfully slowed over the last 2.5. So since the early 2000s. So even before the political headwinds started blowing pretty strongly, there seems to have been a stalling of the standard metrics of globalization. I'm in a room full of people who have spent meaningful time in low and middle income countries over the last 2 decades. I've also done that. I find it hard to believe that market integration seems to have stalled since the early 2000s, if you've spent time there. So then in the second part of the talk, I'm going to invite you to think about globalization more broadly, not just in terms of cross-border tariffs and flows of imports and exports, but as market integration more broadly. How do firms and people in low and middle income countries get connected to new markets, and how has that looked over recent decades? And maybe there has been meaningful market integration in ways that may not be captured in traditional cross-border statistics, through more recent and growing drivers of globalization that are often not directly related to trade policies on import tariffs or investment treaties, but instead are determined by domestic policies. I'll give you some clues in the data on these drivers, define some common features, and then end with some perspective on research and policy. That's what's on the menu. Okay, so let's start with the most widely used statistic to measure globalization, which is exports or imports relative to GDP. Here I'm just doing this for low and middle income countries and high income countries. And what you see is, here, like coinciding with the Great Recession, that there has been a meaningful drop where low and middle income countries don't seem to have recovered over recent years. You want to be careful with these aggregate series because they of course weight the largest countries more, and you wouldn't be sure if this is all just driven by for example China. So if you focus on just low income countries or low middle income countries, so kicking out the large players in the LMIC category, you also see a pretty flat picture, right? Like you would be hard pressed to look at this graph and see this as a continuation of the ages of hyper-globalization that we've had in the early 90s and before. Now, trade economists don't tend to like the ratio of exports and imports over GDP, and the reason is that in the numerator there's gross flows, so just expenditures, and in the denominator there's value added. Okay. Instead, what we often use, which has been very popular in the literature on the gains from trade, think about the ACR formula with the A sitting in this room. So if you look at a fairer comparison of numerator and denominator, it looks like this, and you would have to go to the world input-output tables to do this. So this is for the 43 countries and the rest of the world. That's in the most recent version of the world input-output database. I believe there's some experts in the room on this. I had no idea what to expect. I had never worked with these data. So what I'm computing here is the quintessential single sector ACR statistic, which is how much do countries of their total expenditure spend on production abroad, right? But here the key is that the numerator is essentially the same, but the denominator is now total expenditure. So both in gross terms. Right? And this would be the own trade share that you would use in the simplest quantitative trade model, together with the trade elasticity, to quantify the gains from trade over time. And that looks pretty flat. Now, there's two things I want you to take away, and then a cautionary tale on what these categories are in the weird data. So number one, the own expenditure share in all of these groups is pretty high. Okay, so like within country trade seems to matter. Number two, it looks pretty flat for all the groups. Okay, that's the 2 points. Now the cautionary tale, the fact that the low and middle income country seems to be spending more on themselves, that's counterfactual to most developing countries that you look at. The reason here is that it's just the largest countries. It's just Brazil and China and India that are part of this, which is why it's just 43 countries. It's like European countries and the large countries of the rest of the world. Okay, but again, a pretty flat picture throughout the last 2 decades. So going away from trade, what about the other statistic that we commonly use to quantify globalization, see what's going on? And that's FDI flows, so net inflows and net outflows from low and middle income countries, or to middle income countries. And then we traditionally also divide that by GDP. And again, you would not look at this graph and conclude that the ages of rapid globalization have been continuing over the last 2 decades. These statistics are going to segue nicely into the second part of the talk, but I was honestly not expecting to see these pictures. I was a little surprised that the standard statistics would look like this over the last 2 decades. So what about the policy side? The policy side, if you look at the weighted average applied tariff faced by exporters around the world, every single exporter nation to the rest of the world, that's pretty flat, okay? And then if you break this up by region, that's a bunch of flat lines. And this is not surprising. There were some exciting trade liberalization episodes, right, in 2001, the Vietnamese liberalization that we've heard about yesterday, or the Colombian liberalization that we heard about. But these are bilateral routes that are being affected by relatively modest tariff reductions, and that's small fish relative to the large waves of trade liberalizations we've had before. So not too much action on the policy side either. Closer? Okay, got it. All right, so from all these graphs, we would come away with a pretty sobering picture that, globalization in the standard cross-border metric seems to have close to stalled since the early 2000s. And as I said, it's hard to make sense of that if you've spent time in many low and middle income countries over the last 2 decades. So I invite you to think about globalization more broadly as market integration. Okay, so the reason that as economists we expect globalization to have effects on aggregate and distribution outcomes is because connecting one market to another market leads to changes in prices, leads to changes in availability of intermediate inputs, leads to changes in factor prices as a result of that, maybe productivity changes. And all of these mechanisms are, of course, regardless of where that new market is, right? So it doesn't have to be a tariff liberalization that brings about these challenges, right? There are many, many, many forms of market integration that are not linked to traditional trade policies and that may not show up and be perfectly captured in the standard cross-border metrics. So the question that I'm asking for the next couple of slides is to what extent and how have firms and people in developing countries been connected to new markets over recent decades. And I'm going to do this with a bunch of clues in the data. So the first graph I'm showing here is based on Chinese data. China has a value-added tax. And that means that close to the universe of firm-to-firm transactions in China is subject to reporting requirements. Okay, so this is from the state tax authority. So think of millions of establishments in food and manufacturing and services, the entire economy. And think of every single transaction that they send in a year, so billions of transactions. And what we're doing in this graph is to just take simple averages, right? So each of those establishments that you have is geocoded, so then you know where the seller is and where the buyer is. And you compute bilateral distances of every transaction that's happening in China, subject to VAT reporting. And here I'm just showing the average distance across all those transactions, and just plot this over the period of time that these data have become available. And what you see is that even just over a 4-year period in China, there's a 16% increase in the average distance of firm-to-firm shipments, 17% for services and 15% for manufacturing. So that's just one trend, okay? And it's not conclusive, but it's suggestive of meaningful connection of buyers and sellers across different markets in China, even over the more recent years, where the cross-border statistics have looked pretty lackluster. We can do the same thing for China for equity investments. Okay, so if there's a new establishment that is created in China, there's a reporting requirement. It has to report to the State Administration for Market Regulation, and then has to report every single equity ownership by either other firms or by individuals. Okay, so now we can play the same game. We can geolocate the investor and the investment target for millions of investments that happen every year, millions of new creations of establishments in China. And you just take the simple average distance, just like we did for trade flows before. And what you see is a secular trend, again, increasing over time in distances, not quite as strong as over the 4-year period for trade flows, but clearly there in the data. So again, for both trade flows and investment flows, there seems to be pieces of evidence suggesting that buyers and sellers and people and firms inside of emerging economies have become more connected over time and in different sectors. So what could lead to within country market integration? We've heard some great papers yesterday about ambitious transportation infrastructure investments in China and India and beyond, and that could lead to a reduction in trade costs between regions in different countries. Another obvious candidate is a graph that I love to remind myself of periodically, which I show you here, and that is to remember that just about 2 decades ago, if you went to a low and middle income country, essentially nobody had ever used the internet. And then you fast forward, just a small number of years. Like, let's take the example of China. Around 2000, you know, the penetration rate of people who had ever used the internet was less than 0.1% of the population. You fast forward to 2017, 2018, 2019, and that's close to 900 million people. So a very, very quick development in terms of what we would think of as information and communication costs in a country, right? So this would leave physical trading costs between markets fixed. Like, this would not interface with that. But of course, you know, being able to connect with people through communication or learn about different markets through information can lead to market integration, and has been shown in some existing evidence to do so. So now let's ask the question, what about, you know, coming from within country integration, what about non-traditional ways of exporting that also may not be fully captured in the standard cross-country statistics? And here I come to a topic close to my heart since the third chapter of my PhD, and that is to talk about tourism. Why would I talk about tourism when it comes to exporting? Okay, so several things about tourism. So tourism is a non-traditional way of exporting. Rather than shipping out a restaurant service or shipping out the local transportation service or the hotel bed service, you have to ship around passengers, right? So it's passenger travel that come from outside your country, and they purchase local services as well as cultural amenities and natural amenities. And that's a form of exporting, right? Like, that's a form of trading. You're essentially exporting the non-traded local service to abroad by bringing people from abroad temporarily to consume them. Tourism has been growing very fast and very steadily over the last couple of decades, especially in lower middle income countries. And the question is, you know, how quantitatively important are exports from tourism? And there's something I want to notice on this graph. This is median fractions. If you take the weighted average fractions and you look at countries like China, tourism is not a big deal in China. So this is a perspective from the median, you know, low or low middle income country, or the median low upper middle income country, or the median high income country. It's not the average, so we're not counting, you know, Aruba as like an outlier in there. It's literally like the median country experience. And if you benchmark the receipts that you get from foreign tourism relative to things that we think of as very important for development and for trade and development, here I do it with manufacturing exports, you see that for low income and low middle income countries, that's around 75 to 85% for the median country. Again, this is not China, this is the median country in that bin. That's a meaningful economic channel about global integration that, of course, is often overlooked. We can do this with agricultural exports. If you believe that agricultural exports are more important in low and low middle income countries, the sequence here flips, but the blue curve basically stays where it was before, slightly higher. So it's roughly as important as agricultural exports for the median country. Okay, so this is a form of exporting that is rapidly growing, and, you know, not maybe not very salient in discussions of how low and middle income countries get integrated and exported. What may be even more surprising about tourism, which is something I learned when working on tourism, is that here again, within country integration actually is the biggest story. So if you take the country of Mexico, in the work that I started on Mexican tourism, my presumption was that the tourism industry in Mexico must be absolutely dominated by foreign tourists. It sits at the border of one of the largest demand concentrations of tourism worldwide, the United States, and it's a very integrated, you know, it's a very integrated travel route with respect to the United States. But when you look at the statistics of how much of the total tourism sector receipts in Mexico are driven by foreigners, all foreigners, including Americans, compared to Mexicans, it's about 80% of the tourism sector in Mexico is Mexicans taking long weekends at the beach, visiting family in other regions, doing vacations in Mexico. And that's not the outlier. It's the same in basically every country. Okay, so non-traditional forms of exporting. And then what about foreign direct investment? We've seen that, you know, investment flows have sort of cooled in low and middle income countries as a group as a whole relative to their GDP, but that doesn't mean that there aren't, you know, exciting things happening in sectors that used to be closed off until recently. So if you remember, you know, the GATS agreement on trade and services that dates to the end of the 90s, I want to say. That's a long time ago. but that didn't liberalize, investment in services, which I believe was called Mode 3 at the time. It basically allowed countries a lot of leeway when to open sensitive sectors like wholesale and retail and professional services. And some countries have decided to do so. I failed to find great statistics on FDI flows for multiple countries by sector. So what this is based on is just US multinationals and the value of their foreign investments in different sectors. And what you see is that foreign value in countries outside the EU and outside of Canada, so think of that as LMIC. And what you see is, relatively lackluster growth for overall valuations, but definitely higher growth in certain segments where countries recently decided to open up for FDI. So here's a slide listing some of those recent drivers of market integration in low and middle income countries. That's not a random list. These are questions that I have been working on or plan to work on. There's many other potential topics, but let me walk you through. So the first one is, transportation, that we've heard some great papers about. One of the things that's frequently forgotten in transportation is not just roads and railroads and airports. The development of modern logistics, like the sector of modern logistics, tends to be really hard. I have some experience in different countries. Basically, pulling off what UPS, FedEx, and Amazon are doing in the United States is a hard lift, and it's pretty high tech to do, and requires lots of physical investment on the ground as well. And many low and middle income countries are catching up rapidly, but are in the process of doing so, especially when it comes to servicing the more remote parts of the countries. I talked about reductions in information and communication costs. These could be simple mobile phones in low income countries. It could be smartphones and the internet and e-commerce in low and middle income countries. Exporting through passenger travel, we covered FDI in previously closed sectors. This is a topic that I recently get excited about a lot, and that is, once you think of globalization as market integration, it's kind of everywhere. So think of market integration within a city, right? So think of myself coming home for the kids after school at 6 p.m., not having the time to cook, but being able to order in very, very quickly on one of the delivery apps. That is a meaningful reduction in the trading frictions between me and the universe of restaurants in the San Francisco Bay Area. That would have been unthinkable a couple of decades ago, right? So you can think of that, once we take that broader view of globalization, as market integration in the services sector of a city when it comes to deliveries. You can, think of ride-sharing apps in similar ways, and you can think of the gig economy in ways that's connecting jobs to workers in urban markets. And of course, what's exciting about that field is that these platforms are rapidly growing, and employment is rapidly growing in urban markets in low and middle income countries very, very recently. So this is meaningfully taken off. And then the last bullet is rural-urban migration. So, another form of market integration is migration. Within country integration, as with everything, is massive relative to cross-country migration. Not that that's not important, but it's just orders of magnitude above it. And one of the things, in the broader agenda of looking for forces of market integration in shiny new places, one of the things that that came to our mind recently is that rural-urban migration has all the elements of shifting around employment in some of the spatial equilibrium models that we've seen today. But maybe migrants also help to connect buyers and sellers across regions. So maybe there are additional gains from trade and investment relationships, as you see migrants from an origin living in a city and then potentially returning home and forming business connections. Okay, so this would be another recent force for market integration within countries. So now let's talk about some of the common features and why I think this is an interesting agenda, both for research as well as policy. So many of the channels that we've just discussed, or seen some data snippets on, are not directly related to import tariff cuts, okay, or the looming trade wars. So number one, if you're a champion of market integration, maybe the world is not as glim as you thought. If you expect there to be political backlash on import tariffs and so forth going forward, because there are powerful channels of market integration around the world that are unlikely directly affected just by that. Okay, and those channels are often driven by new technologies and or domestic policies. So not, multilateral policy making that seems to be hard, but domestic policy making, such as infrastructure investment, regulation of the telecom sector, also in some of the existing evidence, those forces of market integration have the same aggregate and distributional implications that you would have in a trade model with multiple countries. Okay, it doesn't really matter across which market it happens, and it doesn't really matter if you're exporting through people or through trade flows. Of course, the results can be different, but the broad conceptual framework is the same thing. So for the same reasons that we care about traditional trade policies such as tariffs, we should also care about a new set of market forces that is driving integration around the world. Those forces are likely to pose new regulatory challenges and policy questions because they've been growing rapidly and are sort of often here for the first time. There's often relatively little existing evidence compared to the evidence you would have of what happens after a trade liberalization or what happens after an investment treaty, which are traditional questions. And they often require different types of data, right? So Comtrade data is awesome data, and I've used some of that data today, but it's not going to make the cut when you're looking at within country integration. So these questions, if you want to study them and inform policy, they often require new types of granular data. Some of which I've shown you some examples for. And on the next slide, I'm going to conclude. And that is that globalization is reportedly entering a period of crisis, which is to be continued. No, sorry, to be confirmed. Some standard metrics suggest that there's a slowdown in low and middle income countries, predating many of the political headwinds that we are facing today. Taking a broader view of globalization as market integration, market integration seems to be alive and kicking in low and middle income countries, with lots of interesting both challenges as well as academic questions about the magnitudes and the consequences. These recent drivers are often not directly related to the import tariff wars that we're all fearing are on the horizon. They give rise to many of the same hopes as well as concerns about inequality or aggregate gains as traditional trade and investment policies, but they're often less salient in media and policy discussions and often with less existing evidence. And I will end it there, and I'm happy to take questions and then depart for lunch together.
Thank you, Ben. I'll actually take the privilege to ask your first question. I think this idea of the indirect effect of trade, it's another area that perhaps will be worth exploring, right? Because, you could think of trade as also having imported institutions, especially when countries were engaging in regional trade agreements. And some of those were the reason of why you saw a lot of this lowering domestic trade frictions, right? But again, it's an area where we know very little. So I guess could be added to your list. Okay, Bob here, and I see many hands.
Hi. Yeah, so my simple question is, how do you reconcile these two seemingly contradictory effects? So is it that these new technologies don't disproportionately benefit international trade, or how should we think of them?
Okay, let me take like 2-3 questions at a time, and then Manuel and Paulo, right?
Think about working remotely, for example. To what extent do we have data about working remotely, like increasing super fast after the pandemic, and whether this would be another layer of these factors?
Okay, Costas, and then we go to Paulo, and then we get you the first round, and then I pick the others. Yeah.
Okay, so this is not necessarily a question that has a precise answer, but I want to hear your view. So the US is following this very aggressive protectionary policy. And for especially developing countries, they run the danger, like if they attach to the US bandwagon, they will be the next kind of following this, they have to comply with all this. But if they kind of try to trade with countries like China, then they run the danger of, having a supply chain from China and then getting cut off because of, the reverberations of the protection measure. So how countries like developing countries or countries don't have like the power of a big country, maybe like Japan and so on, can balance how do they solve this conundrum? And maybe some of the suggestions you mentioned, urbanization, opening inside markets and so on, is the answer. But I just wanted to hear your view.
Paolo?
Yeah, so I have a question related to Bob's point. So that evidence that you showed on firm-to-firm relationships within China increasing a lot, wouldn't you expect that to also lead to more firms exporting then and gaining sufficiency? So again, how do you reconcile kind of these internal market access with external?
Yeah, these are. Oh, another one?
No. Let's start.
Okay.
Otherwise, you're not even taking notes.
Great questions, and of course I don't have all the answers. So let's talk about the reconciliation. So first of all, like even though it seems like I was certain that I would find a decline in traditional measures of globalization, I was a little surprised to see what I showed on the first slides. Potential explanations for why it looks, why the internet, for example, would promote within-country integration a little more than cross-country integration. I mean, take the example of China. The answer is pretty obvious, right? Like, what do Chinese people use the Chinese internet for mainly? Yes, there are elements of connecting with the rest of the world. Is it easy to imagine that effect is stronger for buyers and sellers within China? Absolutely. But again, like I don't want to, like the first part, again, I don't want to, claim that I'm 100% certain that globalization in the traditional metrics stalls. The metrics look the way they do. You've seen the sources, and the within-country metrics look the way that they do. Transport investments is another obvious one why within-country integration would be going up. Tourism is a trickier thing. In principle, we should cover tourism receipts in the trade statistics. And then I have too little detailed knowledge of in which trade statistics it does show up. It does show up in the balance of payments, but in which trade statistic it would show up, if it would always be automatically included in services trade or only in some forms of that. To Costa's point, that's a hard question, which gets into the geopolitics of trade policy, which at least over the time that I can remember being interested and involved in trade policy discussions is a relatively recent development, which means that it's hard. The Cold War period would probably be a natural guidance where people, where countries had to pick alliances, and that also locked you in economically. That was in a much less integrated world with much less global value chains. How do countries maneuver that? I don't claim to have an answer to this. Related to what I just showed you, the main message that would come out here is that market integration over the last couple of decades seems to have many meaningful forms that are basically unrelated to cross-border investment and trade agreements that are the focus in that debate. And that as a policymaker, wanting to reap the aggregate gains of market integration while being careful about the distributional consequences, there are many more domestic policy levers to think about that basically have the same trade-offs that you would also have on trade and development. So that's a bit of a cop-out, but that's where it stopped. And
yeah.
Yes.
So when you have market integration, two main or broad things happen. One is that people get to consume a greater variety of goods and services, but also there are some distributional effects. So, but you lumped both domestic and international market integration together. But given that if you, within countries you have regions with where factor endowments are more similar, don't you expect the domestic market with domestic market integration, the variety effect to dominate the distribution effect, while in the other case, the distribution effect might, the international market integration, the distribution effect probably would dominate the variety effect because of the differences in factor endowments, and that could probably explain why there is less resistance to internal or domestic market integration as opposed to international market integration.
In how you kind of frame some of this, you were sort of thinking about ICT technologies as kind of very similar to what the forces of tariffs. And I'm curious if you think that there's differences that are important to highlight.
Very thought-provoking presentation. One thing that I thought was interesting is that a lot of this echoes this distance elasticity puzzle, that the elasticity of trade, international trade with respect to distance, seems to be going up over time, suggesting that for whatever reason, the way, like because of like multi-stage trading or the increase or the decrease in domestic trade frictions, it's becoming less likely that you want to integrate with very distant partners and you want to integrate more with close by partners. So this seemed like very kind of related to that puzzle, and I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, so on the question of within country integration versus cross-country integration and how that differs, when I say that the forces of market integration give rise to the same set of like hopes and concerns, that doesn't mean that it's going to be the same. It means that conceptually those channels are very closely related. Are the effects of a road network inside a country going to be always meaningfully different from the effects of trade liberalization across the country? Yesterday we've seen a paper where the effect of road networks give rise to opposite signs in different countries. So I think it's a little more complicated than thinking about it in these broad terms. Again, the one thing I will say is that the evidence base that we have for these relatively recent and strongly growing channels of market integration is exactly the frontier that drives me to the office every day, because precisely there are many open questions that we don't have a good handle on. So another cop out for you. Amit, yeah, absolutely right. Like tariffs are related to trading costs, and ICT is related to information and communication costs. Both in our models as well as the empirical evidence that we have, those results are meaningfully different. What is some of the best evidence that we have on holding trade costs fixed, including tariff policy or physical trade costs, and reducing information frictions? There are papers in developing country agriculture where people give price information to farmers across different markets. So the most similarity that I would see is that it tends to be trade creating, right? And that is the closest similarity that I would have in terms of a tariff reduction. Of course, it's trade creating at a given set of tau, right? Like at a given trade cost, which often means that you expect the extensive margin to play a bigger role than the intensive margin. So this is one of the things that you will see in papers that have a reduction in information and communication costs, is like finding new sellers and new buyers in different markets, which is often different than how we think about you and I were already connected. There's a change in the cost of trading between me and you, and then we go from there. What did I forget? Okay.
I think we can continue bilaterally during the lunch, and we reconvene at organizers at 2. Okay, perfect. Thank you very much again.